4. Senses and thinking. How our thoughts are determined by our sensory impressions, in which you will get to eat a lemon, take a walk on the beach, and find an understanding for how our sensory impressions determine our thoughts and our behaviors. So far, you have learned about how our thoughts, feelings, and mental states affect us physically, and that the opposite also holds. At this point, we'll have to go back to the beginning, the very beginning, for the truth is, we started somewhere in the middle. If you're going to learn to read thoughts, I think we should spend a little time discussing what thoughts really are. But don't worry, this isn't a theoretical or strictly academic matter. It is, just like everything else in this book, something you will definitely be able to use in practice. When we think, we generally initiate one of two different processes. Either we remember, that is, we repeat thoughts we've had before, or we construct new thoughts that we haven't had before. Either way, our sensory impressions play an important part in our thinking. Our senses of hearing, vision, feeling, taste, smell, and balance are not only important for navigating our environment but are also used when we think about things that are not related to the direct sensory input we receive. We use our memories of different sensory impressions and experiences to think. If we reflect on a memory, like a vacation we enjoyed, we do it by visualizing what it looked like, imagining the sounds we heard there, perhaps even the smells, and so on. When we remember, we recreate sensory impressions we have had previously. However, sensory impressions are also important for constructing new thoughts. The following text is inspired by a classic hypnotic induction, in which the technique of getting the subject to internalize his or her thought processes is used. Read the text and try to immerse yourself in it as much as you can, and don't worry, you won't get hypnotized. Imagine walking on a beach, you're barefoot, and you can feel the sand yield to your feet as you walk. It is evening time, so the sand is nice and cool between your toes. The sun is low in the sky, and you have to squint when you face it. The only sound you can hear is that of the waves rolling in and out and an occasional seagull shrieking as it swoops over the water. You stop for a moment and take a deep breath. You can smell the seaweed in the air. You see a shell in the sand and pick it up. You hold the shell in your hand, touching its coarse and white surface with your thumb. You put the shell in your pocket and start walking again. Now you begin to hear voices murmur, and laughter, and in the light ahead you can see the silhouettes of people sitting in an outdoor restaurant. You start to smell the scent of the food and realize how hungry you are. Your mouth begins to water, and you pick up your pace as the scents and noises grow stronger. If you were truly immersed in that story, you could practically hear the waves beating, feel the sand between your toes, and smell the seaweed. Your mouth may even have watered at the end. All this despite the fact that you may never have had an experience exactly like the one I described. If you couldn't remember the experience, it had to be constructed. To understand the story, you made a jigsaw puzzle from pieces of other similar memories. You have held a seashell, so you know what that feels like. You know the smell of seaweed, but perhaps you've never walked on a beach at sunset and have no such memory available to use. So you created it from images you've seen, other people's stories, movie scenes, and other impressions that helped you recreate the experience. In a way, you created a new experience in your mind, which became just as real as if you'd actually experienced it. We're always using our sensory impressions in this way when we think. Sometimes we do it in our minds, internally, as you did when you wandered through that story just now. On other occasions, we use our sensory impressions externally, as we do when we perceive the world around us. We are continuously switching between using our senses internally, in our minds, and externally, when we experience our surroundings. The more we concentrate on what somebody is saying to us, or the contents of a text we're reading, the more internal we become. For instance, you have no idea right now how your left big toe feels. That is, until you were just reminded of it, and automatically zoomed out, externally, to make sure. Big toe, I remember, I have one of those. Our brain doesn't distinguish very well between internal and external use of our senses, and more or less the same areas of the brain are activated in both cases. Sour exercise or a cheap hallucination. Imagine holding a peeled lemon. Feel its weight and softness in your hand. It's a little sticky from all the juice. You can smell the strong scent of the juice. And now imagine taking a good bite out of the lemon. Imagine the sour lemon juice filling your mouth and dripping down your throat. If you really imagine that, you will have had a physical reaction. Your mouth will have contracted, and your saliva production will have increased, and all you did was use your imagination and an internal sensory impression. Your brain reacted, sending the same signals to your body, your mouth, in this case, as it would have done if the sensory impression had been external, i.e., if you've really bitten into a lemon. Here's an interesting question to ponder. If our brains have such a hard time separating imaginary situations from actual experiences of the world, how are we to know what is real and what is a hallucination? And is there any real difference? That's worth thinking about. Sensory impressions. We prefer different kinds of sensory impressions. Our sensory impressions are an important part of the content of our thoughts. We also prefer certain sensory impressions to others. Which ones we prefer varies for different people, but a large number of people prefer visual impressions for internally thinking about or externally experiencing the world. Others prefer auditory input. A third group prefers kinesthetic impressions, e.a., all physical impressions, like touch, temperature, and so on. The internal elements that correspond to kinesthetic sensory impressions are our emotions. Very emotional people belong to this group. How do you feel? Can be about your emotional state just as readily as it can be about a sprained ankle. A small number of people prefer taste and smell input. For practical purposes, they are often grouped with the kinesthetics. However, finally, there is a group of people that don't prefer any of the mentioned sensory impressions when they reason about the world. They use logical deduction and principles and like to deliberate carefully. Even debating with themselves, they are often called digital or binary thinkers, since to them everything is either right or wrong, yes or no, black or white. There is rarely any middle ground here. I refer to them as neutral, as they are not as dependent on external stimuli as the visual, auditory, or kinesthetic groups. Of course, we all use all of these sensory impressions, but to greater or lesser extents. One of our senses is dominant, and we use it the most. The others are used to verify that whatever information our dominant, or primary, sense has given us is correct. We also vary in how we prioritize our senses and what weight we give them. Some people are extremely visual. For instance, they rely almost entirely on their visual experiences and hardly use their other senses at all. Others are mainly auditory, but use their visual impressions almost as much. Others still are mainly visual, but use memories first, emotional ones, and auditory middle ones second, to support and verify their visual experiences, and so on. Different senses make for different ways of thinking. This is an interesting thing to know. Depending on which sensory impression we prefer, we understand the world in a certain way, which can differ from the way others understand the world. We find different things important and communicate in different ways, depending on which sensory impressions we use to interpret the world around us. If you know of an easy way to find out what sensory impressions somebody prefers, you will also, to a great extent, be able to understand how she thinks, how she prefers to communicate, and what is important or uninteresting to her. Having this kind of knowledge about other people will improve your mind reading skills immensely, not to mention your rapport skills. Now Peel give you that easy way. Looking around. Eye movements and sensory impressions. In neuroscience, it has been known for some time that when we think, we activate different parts of the brain, and depending on which part is being activated, our eyes seem to move in certain ways. This connection has been named LEM, or lateral eye movement. In the late 70s, psychology student Richard Bandler and linguist John Grinder, the founders of the often controversial field of neuro-linguistic programming, formulated a theory of something they called EAC, eye accessing cues. They had already understood that sensory impressions were very important to our thought processes, and now they claimed that you can tell which sensory impressions are activated by observing eye movements. The EAC model looks like this. This model has often been misunderstood. The figures in the EAC model have often been interpreted as showing how we all organize our thoughts, but Bandler and Grinder only intended the model as an example, albeit one that applies to many people. In their own words, from the book Frogs into Princes, you will find people who are organized in odd ways, but even somebody who is organized in a totally different way will be systematic. Their eye movements will be systematic for them. Anybody who doesn't follow this system will always have his own model, however, and it is easy to discover with the help of some control questions. There will be more about that later on. Note that I am using the word model here. That is because this is, necessarily, a simplification and generalization. If, after asking some control questions, you notice that the person you're talking to doesn't seem to follow the model, don't use it. Remember the words of Erickson: if it doesn't work, do something else. Despite this, the EAC model seems to be useful most of the time. There really seems to be something to that old chestnut about the eyes being the windows of the soul, or windows of the mind, at least, what the common model says. Then, is this: people who think in images look up and to the left when they are remembering, and up and to the right when they are constructing new images in their minds. An example of a new, constructed, image-based thought would be if you imagined the Mona Lisa as having been painted by a 5-year-old. Please note that this is different from the popular, but grossly overgeneralized notion that people look to the right when they lie. The glance for auditory thoughts is straight to the sides, to the left for memories, like when you're thinking about what somebody said to you, to the right for new thoughts, like when you imagine what you'd like somebody to say to you. Physical sensations and emotions are located down and to the right. Imagine painting your house with stripes. How would you write your name upside down? Auditory memory. How does your favorite song begin? Imagine the sound of your alarm clock going off. Do you remember exactly what she said before she left? Auditory construction. Can you imagine Barack Obama on helium? What kinds of voices do you think Laurel and Hardy had? How would Bruce Springsteen sound underwater? Kinesthetic memory. Do you remember how hot it was last summer? How does a pair of ripe old socks smell? Imagine eating a lemon. Talking to yourself. Internal dialogue. Can you ask yourself if you often speak to yourself? What do you say when you're completely alone and something goes wrong? Speech and understanding. How our senses affect our language. Another way of finding out which kinds of sensory impressions somebody prefers is to listen to the person speak. Speech is full of predicates, words that describe actions, and metaphors, images and similes we use to describe things. According to writers Joseph O'Connor and John Seymour, the kind of sensory impression we prefer determines the kinds of words and phrases we use in our speech. Visual words. A visual person uses words that make sense in visual contexts. She prefers words like look, focus, picture, portray, insight, shiny, visualize, perspective, see, clarify, illustrate, reveal, illusion, show, vision, light. She uses expressions like, I need to take a closer look at this. I see your point. I want to see you. Show me what you mean. In 10 years, you'll look back at this and laugh. The future looks bright. She's a colorful person. Without a shadow of a doubt. This has tinted your opinions. Like a flash of lightning from a clear blue sky. Auditory words. An auditory person will use different words that ring true to her. Say, emphasis, rhythm, loud, tone, monotonous, deaf, ring, ash, sell, discuss, comment, audible, listen, mute, screaming, dissonant, voice, harmonious. She says things like, listen to what I have to say. He voices his opinions. What a loud color, we're on the same wavelength, living in harmony with nature. It rings a bell. Word for word. I've never heard anything like it. I think I speak for all of us, so to speak. Kinesthetic words. A kinesthetic person, most often a touch or emotions-oriented person, but in this context also one whose primary sense is taste or smell, feels the most comfortable using terms like touch, handle, press tight, warm, cold, contact, tension, stress, solid, sore, hold, grasp, tangible, heavy, light, even, hard, sour, juicy. She will emphasize expressions such as, get a taste of this. That stinks. Are we going to rush into something new? It finally sunk in. Between a rock and a hard place, I could feel it all over my body. We've only scratched the surface. I can't quite pin it down. He's a fragile personality, a good foundation to work from. She's sweet. Neutral words. Finally, a neutral person, WHO, prefers internal dialogue with words that are not related to the senses, like decide, determine, think,